Not a real long chapter, it's somewhat brief. It does mark a transition in the book of Ezekiel, this prophecy. Remember from last time we looked at two chapters, 4 and 5, where Ezekiel was actually doing his prophecy somewhat in drama. Remember the brick that he drew the city of Jerusalem on? He laid siege to the brick, he built up ramps to it, things that people of that day would readily understand. What happened in 601 BC is probably the time that Ezekiel and those that he's living around were taken as exiles out of Jerusalem and Judea into Babylon, anticipating that they would soon be returning. And Jeremiah said, you might as well get comfortable, you're going to be there for 70 years. But not everyone obviously believed Jeremiah, and not everyone believes Ezekiel either. He's talking about why they are there and what's going to happen in Jerusalem. We don't really understand this with the intensity that Jews of yesteryear would have understood it. When you look at the temple in Jerusalem, that temple is God's dwelling place. Inside the Holy of Holies, there between the cherubim that are on top of the Ark of the Covenant is God's seat, His mercy seat. His dwelling is there among His people. The curtain there, the veil, separates the people from God and His holiness. And in their minds was, as long as we have the temple, as long as we have God's dwelling place, nothing can come against it. God surely would not abandon His house. And that's what they were undoubtedly thinking, or at least many of them were. And Ezekiel is going to say the very opposite, because in just a few years, right around 587, 586 BC, Jerusalem was going to fall, and this time completely. Nebuchadnezzar was going to come down once again. The armies of the Babylonians are going to come down, lay siege to Jerusalem, and this time they're going to destroy it. They're not just simply going to carry off captives, they're going to destroy the city. Now the question that Ezekiel is answering in his prophecy tonight, and he's going to be addressing it in many subsequent chapters as well in one way or another, is going to be answering the question, why? Why is this happening? Why is God doing this? What is what is causing this to occur? And Ezekiel is going to tell the people that are listening, this is why. And you should know why. And as a matter of fact, we'll get to this probably tonight before we finish, at least with this chapter, is that what God did, that in fulfillment of what Ezekiel was proclaiming, worked. It didn't call the people back fully and totally to God. However, they would never again would be susceptible to worship false gods and idols. It stopped it. Prior to this time, though, the practice of the Israelites was deeply involved in idolatry. And Ezekiel is going to use some of the most startling language to depict what these people were actually worshiping. English will not give you the startling nature of what Ezekiel was saying. As a matter of fact, Ezekiel somewhat coined a term to refer to idols. It's a rare term that he almost uses exclusively. It's not the regular term to refer to, or the word that refers to an idol. And when we look at the idols in just a few moments, I'll tell you more about what kind of image Ezekiel was using. And it's somewhat shocking. A little bit later, we will look at two chapters. One will be chapter 16, the other will be chapter 23. And again, he uses very, very shocking, offensive language to describe what he is trying to describe. And again, English will not really help as fully as if we were reading the Hebrew Bible, but nevertheless, it's going to be graphic enough that we'll see that. And we'll probably, those chapters, we're going to hit the high points. We're not going to go that deeply. I don't think we need to. I can kind of give you a summary of what he's doing and why he's doing it, and you can look at the graphic language yourself at times. So we'll handle that with a little bit more sensitivity. So, with those things kind of mentioned as we introduce, let's go ahead and begin with chapter 6, verse 1. The translation that I'm using is a translation that's actually rather new, and at the same time it's not. And you may be thinking, well, that sounds contradictory. It's new in the sense that, well, let me first say why it's not new. It's not new in the sense that it is the New American Standard, 1995 edition, that has been in some spots translated a little more literally. And so it's called the Legacy Standard Bible, but the copyright is held by the same group, the same company as it were, the same ministry that holds the New American Standard. Okay? Now, I know that doesn't mean a whole lot to you, probably, but I'm going to read it. And one of the unique features of this modified translation, the New American Standard, 1995 edition, is that in the Old Testament, the name of God is also used. It's not substituted. Remember, if you've got an English Bible, you probably have the word, when God's name appears in the Old Testament, it'll be the word Lord in capital letters. That is to indicate to you that it is God's name, not a title. The word God is a designation of a particular kind of being. And it can be used of God, of false gods. It can be used in reference to angelic beings. It can be used in a lot of... Actually, in one sense, you remember Samuel? This prophet Samuel? In one sense, after he died, he's called a god. Well, actually, he's called an Elohim, which is a word that normally means simply God. If we were Orthodox Jewish today, when every time we would come to a reference to God, we would say Hashem. Hashem means simply the name. And the reason why that is done is it was believed among Jewish people of yesteryear, and also in Orthodox Judaism today, that God's name is so holy it should never be stated. It should never be said. So they use substitutes. When the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, was made, it was done by 70 scholars, Jewish scholars, that what they feared was that the Hebrew language was going to die and nobody could read the Old Testament anymore. But at the time, everybody could read, well, most everybody who's literate could read Greek. So they translated the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. Well, when they were doing that, this is what those scholars would do. Every time they, at least is what I was taught, every time they came to God's name, they ceremonially cleansed themselves, washed their hands and whatnot, and they also changed ink. They had a special ink they used only to write God's name. So that was some of the reverence. And some English translations and translators have followed that kind of approach. Do we know what God's name actually is? Well, not exactly. The reason for that is Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, originally had no vowels in the words. They were just a string of consonants. Interestingly enough, if you go to Israel today, Hebrew words do not have vowels. To us, you're like, oh my goodness, how in the world they know what they're reading? Because when they're from kids on up, they intuitively know what it was supposed to be. So, in the Hebrew Bible, you have God's name, 4 consonants. Y-H-W-H. That's it. We don't know exactly how to pronounce that. What vowels were used to pronounce the word. And we don't know. Closest guesstimation is it can be pronounced Yahweh. It can be pronounced with a little more guttural sound, as Hebrew usually is, or it could be Yahweh, because what we call a W, or what we refer to as a W, can have that V sound. Now, aren't you glad you came? All right, I tell you all that because you're going to hear God's name, not simply a reference to God. Verse 1, and the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, set your face toward the mountains of Israel and prophesy against them. Now, this is where the transition changes. Before, Ezekiel was acting out his prophecies. Now he's actually beginning to prophesy. He's just using words. But he's still doing some of the demonstration that he's been doing thus far. He's standing, he's facing the hills of Israel, and he's prophesying against them. And say, mountains of Israel, hear the word of Lord Yahweh. Thus says the Lord Yahweh to the mountains, the hills, the ravines, and the valleys, behold, I myself am going to bring a sword on you, and I will destroy your high places. Okay, I'm going to park for a moment. Early on, when Israel first moved into the Promised Land, it was permissible to worship God at different places throughout the land. Now, when they moved into the land of Canaan, they were going to find that there were going to be all of these shrines to Molech, to Baal, Asherah, Ashtaroth, those gods and goddesses all over the land, because the people were pagans. They were to destroy all those places. But the temple had not yet been built. The tabernacle still was in existence, and it moved from place to place. So you were permitted to have a place, a private shrine, as it were, for worship of God. Usually in a family unit, the oldest brother, who now would be the leader of the clan, you could say the father, he would be responsible for the offering of sacrifice and the worship there of God. Now, later on, the ark was finally, and during David's reign, was brought into Jerusalem as well as the tabernacle. And then in the rule of Solomon, which was, good 450 years plus before this, the temple was actually built. And then it became stationary. At that time, you came to offer sacrifices, you came to offer your gifts, you came to Jerusalem and offered them there at the temple. No more was it allowed to have the high places. Now, if you were familiar with the writer of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, we don't know for sure who wrote that, but whoever was the author or even authors of that, one of the things they would often bemoan were the high places. They would say, even when there was a good Judean king, they'd say, kind of with regret, seemingly, but the high places were still in use. The only one of the ancient kings that I can think of, at least right now, is Josiah. Josiah destroyed the high places. Okay? But Josiah in 608 BC was killed by the Egyptian army that was coming up out of Egypt, moving, that's going to engage the Babylonians. And caught in the mix of that was Josiah, and he was killed. So his reforms didn't really take root, because then after his death and his son took over and the subsequent followers, it went right back to the rank paganism that preceded Josiah. So the reform didn't last long. I want to read a little bit about the high places. I want to read to you a description of what they were like. And they weren't always high places. They weren't always on hilltops or on hillsides. Sometimes they could be in valleys and ravines. What they were was just shrines for idolatry to take place. This is what this author says, this scholar. He says, at God's command, the prophet turned his face against the mountains and preached a sermon against them. These mountains were centers of idolatrous worship in shrines and groves of trees and high places. Such shrines were dedicated to Canaanite gods. Elijah, Hosea, Amos, all condemned them. These high places consisted of an altar for offering sacrifices, a wooden pole to represent the female goddess Asherah, a stone pillar to represent the male deity, a small incense altar, a tent that was used for eating sacred meals and practicing sacred prostitution. They were popular places of worship in the days of both Israel and Judah. Josiah, the last good king of Judah, led a revival of the Israelite faith that was a valiant attempt to eradicate idolatry and restore true worship. The revival began when the high priest found the book of the law in the temple where it had been forgotten and neglected. Because neither the priests nor the people cooperated, Josiah's reforms were largely superficial. Pharaoh Necho killed him in 609 BC on his way to confront the Babylonians. After Josiah died, the people openly returned to idolatry. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what these places were like. And they were scattered all over. So that's the declaration. That's why he's told, Ezekiel is told to turn his face toward the mountains and preach against them. Verse 4. So your altars will become desolate, and your incense altars will be broken, and you will make your slain fall in front of your idols. I will also put the dead bodies of the sons of Israel in front of their idols, and I will scatter your bones all around their altars. What's going on? What's happening here? Well, if you have a sacred space, whether you are talking about the temple in Jerusalem or you're talking about the high places that were considered sacred spaces for these false gods of the Canaanites, if you contaminated those spaces, they would be no longer fit or usable to be considered a sacred space to worship the god or a god. It's inside of Jerusalem today. But there's a valley. And the valley of Hinnom. And today it's a park. When you look there, you can see there's a park. There's nice green grass. There's swings there now. But it's not always been that way. Back during the days of Manasseh, who was the son of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was a good king. Not a perfect king, but a good one. Manasseh was a terrible one. As a matter of fact, his reign was longer than any other king. It was for 55 years. what he imported into Judah, in Jerusalem, was the worship of the most vile of the false gods, Molech. God had commanded his people. A phrase is a figure of speech that is somewhat unfamiliar to us. It says, "You shall not make your children pass through the fire." That's the literal phrasing. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means you are not to practice child sacrifice. And the form of Baalism that came from Jezebel and also the worship of Molech, both were expressions of pagan worship that practiced child sacrifice. In one place, I think I don't remember for sure if it's in Megiddo or Megiddo or one of the others. I don't think that's quite right. But archaeologists have found in that vicinity these clay jars filled with the remains of babies. They found lots of them. And so the children of Israel in the Valley of Hinnom, just outside of Jerusalem at the time, now it's in Jerusalem, they practiced child sacrifice during the days of Manasseh. Manasseh even sacrificed one of his own children to the vile god Molech. Evil. I mean, the most unthinkable evil. So, by Jesus' day, that valley could never be used again for any kind of considered to be sacred space. Do you know what happened after the days of Manasseh? They made it into a garbage dump. So you take your refuse there. You take your dead cats. I don't know if they had cats or not, but you take your dead, pet dogs, cats, dead, anything. And you wouldn't, if you had a cow that would die, or an ox, or a sheep that would die, somewhat without being properly prepared, they couldn't eat it. So they take it there. If an indigent person had no family to care for him or too poor to be cared for him, sometimes when he would die, they'd take the body and they would throw it into Gehenna. The whole purpose of doing that was to make it unfit for sacred space. It could never, ever again be used for any kind of worship, not even pagan worship. And Jesus used that image. He called it the Valley of Hinnom. He called it a Gehenna. So most of the time, when you may have a translation, especially King James Version, New King James Version, some of those will have the word hell. Jesus would use the word or talk about hell. The word he's using there is Gehenna, garbage dump, a place that was smoldering much of the time, on fire. And it was a vivid picture of a very, very a place unfit for any kind of sacred space. It could not be used for anything like that. And when you hear this, Jesus says this in Mark's Gospel, where the worm doesn't die and the fire isn't quenched. What's he talking about? Gehenna. That's what he's talking about. That's the word he used. That's the word. And it became a picture of what's coming for the unrighteous dead, of what we call hell. It became a visual reminder of what he was talking about. Okay. So, sacred space now contaminated, not even useful for anything sacred again. Verse 5. And I will also put the dead bodies of the sons of Israel in front of their idols, and scatter your bones all around the altars. Verse 6. In all of your places of habitation, cities will become waste, and the high places will be desolate, that your altars may become waste and desolate, and your idols may be broken and cease. Your incense altars may be cut in pieces, and your works may be blotted out. Verse 7, the slain will fall among you. And here's a phrase that I want you to pay close attention to. And you will know that I am Yahweh. You will know that I am the Lord. When will they know this? In about 13 years they're going to know this. Ezekiel is proclaiming what is going to come. What's going to happen. So I ask you the question, how do we know? How did the Jews of yesteryear, how did they know that Ezekiel was actually a prophet of God and not somebody that was having some sort of mental episodes? Because what he said came true. The Old Testament test of a prophet is if what he says comes true, he is a prophet of God. If it doesn't come true, stone him to death. He's a false prophet. That's kind of you kind of want to pay attention. If you think you've got a prophecy, you better make sure God's the one speaking to you, right? If you were right 80% of the time, that's pretty good. That's better than weatherman, right? If you were right 80% of the time and still were wrong on some, you're a false prophet. 100%. That's a pretty high standard, isn't it?
So how did, like Ezekiel or some of the prophets, how did they get the message out to all the people? Did they go to different villages and proclaim the same thing, or did he?
If they were told to do that, they would have migrated around. The thing the interesting aspect of this is a little bit different than our culture. Actually, a lot different. You may be surprised by this. I was really surprised by this. People of yesteryear were much better at remembering things than you and I are. If you want to remember something, what do? You write it down. And then hopefully remember where you wrote it. Okay? But even not that far back in our own history, people had an ability to remember a lot more. I heard one person talking about this capacity to remember, like the Lincoln-Douglas debates. If you and I were living here in Salem when Lincoln and Douglas debated up here, we could listen to the debate. It may go on 2 hours, 3 hours, something like that. And we could go home and someone would ask you, well, what did they say? Well, Mr. Lincoln said this, and then Douglas said this, and then Lincoln responded. We'd be able to do it almost verbatim, because the memories, you didn't have the ability to write everything down, but you had the ability to remember. To answer your question, people heard Ezekiel, and people could have been able to tell others pretty much what Ezekiel said. So it would spread that way. There's another way it spread. It was written down. And when it was written down, it was copied. And it was shared among other people that actually believed what he was saying. Those that did not believe it, of course, would not write it down to keep a record of it, but those that did would. So you'll find that, like Jeremiah, for example, he had Baruch was someone who wrote down what he preached, and so you had those. So it would spread various ways, and people didn't have, they weren't doing reels all the time to take up their time and fill their days. They want to know things. They would talk. The oral traditions of one family to another, sitting around a fire, telling stories about stories that they had been told, passing them down. It's quite interesting. Do you know, and most times we, as Christians, we don't know this, that almost every civilization, every people group, has some kind of creation story and flood story that shares points that had to come from an original source. There are just too many details. I put something on, I think, a church's Facebook about Native Americans, the Delaware Indians, a creation story and having a flood story. And it was incredibly similar in many places to what the Bible talks about. And so there was that kind of culture was prevalent. Look at verse 8. However, I will leave a remnant, for you will have those who escape the sword among the nations when you are scattered among the lands. One of God's, well, let me back up for this, to say this. God made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then to Jacob's descendants, what we later refer to as, Abraham was the first one called a Hebrew. Through his line, God had made a promise, an eternal promise. And God cannot lie. So when God makes a covenant or a promise that is embodied in a covenant, He has to keep it. He has bound Himself to that. So even when He is going to bring incredible disaster upon His people, there's always going to be a remnant. He is not going to completely and totally annihilate the people, even though they deserve it. He can't do that. Why can't He do that? Because He's promised. So there will always be, as an expression of His grace, there will always be a remnant. Verse 9. Then those who will escape will remember me. Okay, that's important. Among the nations to which they will be carried captive, how I have been broken over their adulterous hearts, which have turned away from me, and by their eyes which played the harlot after their idols. And they will loathe themselves to their own faces for the evils which they have done, for all their abominations. I want to talk about the word picture that is mentioned here. It is, God is saying literally here, my people have broken my heart. Why have they, or how have they broken His heart? Where they're like an adulterous wife, going from man to man, forsaking her husband, and taking up with other men in adulterous relationships. That's the picture. And God is saying that He is like a broken-hearted husband who has such a wife as that. He's got more of them. And by the way, let me kind of help you at this point. When you go to the time of Moses and the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, when they get to Mount Sinai, you know the story. They camp down there. Moses goes up on the mountain, and what does he receive from the Lord there? Well, the Ten Commandments. They receive the covenant. The covenant. What it is a, in their culture it makes perfect sense. To us it doesn't. It is a marriage contract. God is saying, I will bind myself to you, and your responsibilities in this covenant are these 10 things. You are to follow these 10. That is our agreement. That is our covenant. That's what binds us together. That is our marriage contract. And here He's saying, God's people have turned away from that. Think about the first 4 commands. First commands are the people's responsibility before God. You shall not, what? What are some of those? You shall not have any other gods before me, or behind me, or beside me. What else?
Thou shalt not make any images.
You shall not make any images, any graven images. And you shall remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. All right? But all of those point to that relationship. Is that covenant. It's a marriage. And yet here they are. And it's not just simply one adulterous relationship. It's repeated over and over and over. Verse 10. Then, remember I told you to watch for this phrase? Then they will know that I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. I have not said in vain that I would do this evil, or maybe you can supply a word, some translations supply a word prior to evil, this calamity, or whatever, evil against them. Thus says the, let's pause right there. That's exactly what God said was going to happen if they break the covenant. If they break the covenant, He is going to judge them. If they break the covenant, He's going to allow their enemies to overwhelm them. So He is doing what he clearly said that He would do. Verse 11. Thus says the Lord Adonai, Yahweh, strike your hands together, stamp your foot, and say, Alas, because of all the evil abominations of the house of Israel, which will fall by the sword, by famine, and by the plague. He who is far off will die of the plague. He who is near will fall by the sword, and he who remains in the besiege will die by famine. Thus will I spend my wrath on them. Okay. Get the picture of what's going to take place here. He tells Ezekiel to do something. And different commentators, whether it is Jewish commentators of yesteryear or even Jewish commentators of today, or scholars that we may depend a lot on, conservative scholars, even liberal scholars, they have several different approaches in trying to understand what in the world is he doing. Is it like a victory dance? Clapping his hands and stomping his foot? Is that what it is? Is he mocking the people there? That's what God telling him to do? Mock the people that's going to be judged? Is that what's going on? Is it some sort of joyful thing? Or is it some sort of grieving kind of thing? And the answer to that, you want to know what the answer is? I do not know. Nor does anyone else, for sure. I think we're safe to assume whether it's joy, it is an expression of some kind of emotion, whether it is joy or sorrow, you end up with about the same result. I think it's probably sorrow. That kind of physical display is something that's pointing to the sorrow of this time, of what is taking place, this calamity. Verse 13. Then you will, there's that phrase again that I want you to be sure to pay attention with. Then you will know that I am the Lord, I am Yahweh. When their slain are among their idols, all around their altars, on every high hill and on the top of the mountains, under every green tree and under every leafy oak, the places where they offered a soothing aroma to all of their idols. Again, we're calling back to what we looked at a few moments ago about the contamination around these places. But now here is the thing that I want you to be aware of. Are y'all with me still? Okay. What's the deal here? Why is this happening? It's because the people have broken the covenant. The people have turned away from God. The strongest way, or the clearest way to illustrate this is that of the adulterous people that were not faithful to God. They were chasing after other lovers, these other gods, these false gods of the Canaanite people groups. Now, having said that, back to, there's something else here. There's something else being demonstrated here in God's wrath upon His people who have departed from Him. What is it? Well, we've looked at it several times. It's appeared. It's going to appear totally of 4 times. Once it's going to be in verse 9. They will remember me. But the others are very similar in the statement. For you will know that I am the Lord. You will know that I am Yahweh. How will they know this? What's that? It came true. Okay, the prophecy that is being given by Ezekiel is going to come true. So they're going to know that the Lord has indeed spoken. But they're also going to know when all of this takes place. When the destruction of all these places of worship, all the dead bodies contaminating these sacred or holy spaces, that's going to take place. They will know that I am the Lord. That I have done this because I promised your forefathers that if you turn from me to other gods, this is what I will do. Yes?
Was this not the same things that God had said that He would bring upon Israel's enemies?
Yes.
So actually, it was like He was saying, you've become my enemy, and I'm going to bring all these things on you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They had become His enemy. He had become His enemy. And we'll have a few minutes to deal with this too, or more questions if you have them. Verse 14. So throughout all their habitations, I will stretch out my hand against them, and I will make the land more desolate and desecrated than the wilderness toward Diblah. Thus they will know that I am the Lord. Sometimes a lesson can be quite painful. But like I mentioned 4 times here where that phrase is reoccurring. And one of the rules of interpretation that's helpful is when you observe something that's being repeated, it's important. It's important. 4 times. You will know, they will know that I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. Okay, questions or comments?
So what is the difference between when they, Moses that went in and they said, how will I know that, and the Lord said, I am sent you. What is the difference between that name and Yahweh?
Nothing. That's what it means. That's what it means. When God said, I am that I am, tell them I am sent you. That's kind of a rough Hebrew phrase, but it's the essence of the name Yahweh. So what Moses experienced there was actually, he's even asking about the name. They're going to ask me who sent me. This is what you are to say to them. And the interesting thing, I'm glad you alluded to that because there is a very important principle that's buried in that whole encounter. And sometimes we don't notice it. When you're reading that, Moses is before the burning bush. He's got his shoes off. He's progressing. He's getting his marching orders, so to speak. This is what God says to him. How will I know that and that kind and God says something to him that we so easily forgot. God said, you will know that I have sent you when you are back on this mountain with the people of God, with the Israelites. You will know that I sent you. Did you get it? Moses, when will you know when you get back here. When you get back here and have all the, you've led the Israelites out of Egypt, out of slavery. When you get back here, you'll know that I sent you. And sometimes that kind of escapes us a little bit. That we think that we've got to know everything up front. We don't. We don't. Has God sent you?
How is it
You will know.
translated then? In the Greek or in the Hebrew, I am versus Yahweh.
Well, the best way we can get it into, well, it ends up being that the translation is a part of what Yahweh actually means. I am. It's a phrase, it's like this. It's the eternal presence. What I mean by that is, God is. Yes, He was. Yes, He will be, but He is. Again, I am that I am. I will be what I will be. There's a lot of kind of shades in there, but the word, the understanding was among the Jews is I am is a very important statement because God that's the response to the name. I am. And Jesus used it. He used it a lot. And the people who heard Him knew what He meant. And that's why they picked up stones to stone Him to death. English sometimes, you might have notes in your Bible that kind of help you at this point. When Jesus uses the I am statements, sometimes it doesn't really come across quite as powerfully as it did to those Jews that heard it originally. What I mean by that is, Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. Now, I want you to notice something about that. You got the tenses wrong. The tenses don't quite fit the sentence. I mean, Greek had tenses. It wasn't that he could have said, before Abraham was, I was. Or before Abraham was, I was there. He doesn't say it that way. Before Abraham was, I am. And the phrase is ego eimi. Literally, it is an emphatic statement meaning I am. So the Jews, when he used that word, that phrase, they knew exactly what he was saying.
He was ready to stone him, wasn't he?
They were ready to stone him on one occasion because he said that. When he said before Abraham was, I am. They knew, who are you? Say, you being a man, make himself out to be God. They knew exactly what he meant. Exactly what he meant. So the name of God, 4 consonants, YHWH, is closely related to the idea of this eternal I am. And that's where, and it became very important to be sure. That's a good question. There's a lot more wrapped up than we got time to get. Yes.
Yeah, I got on my Bible app on my phone. There's one translation that I had downloaded for a while, and the word Jehovah. Those guys' name throughout the whole Bible, throughout that translation, throughout the whole Bible is Jehovah. And I know that came from that YHWH, didn't it?
Well, kinda, but no. Yes. Well, fundamentally, there is no J in Hebrew. You need to know that. And as I understand the way it worked, when German scholars couldn't pronounce a Y sound, they cannot pronounce a W sound either. It won't be water, it'll be Vater. Va, this kind of sound. Well, since German didn't really have the Y sound, they substituted they have a J sound. And they kind of combined 2 words, Adonai and Yahweh, and they put a J in front of it and call it Jehovah. You tell a Jehovah's Witness that God's name is not Jehovah, it freaks them out. But His name was not Jehovah. It never was. It never will be. And it certainly is not. Jehovah is just an attempt of bringing it into English. You may be surprised too, and I'm not going to throw rocks at anybody that wants to use the word Jehovah. I mean, we sing Jehovah Jireh, sometimes every once in a while. And not that I'm going to be overly freaked out about it, but when you go from one language to another, it's sometimes pretty challenging. Do you know how to pronounce Jesus actually? Jesus. Jesus. That's what it is in Greek. It's Jesus. But that wasn't Jesus' actual, as a translation of his name, that wasn't his actual name. His name would have been pronounced something to the effect of Yeshua. Joshua. That was his name. It was a very common name in the first century. It was used a lot. Now, if you translate Yeshua into Greek, you have the same kind of issue, trying to get the sounds that are there from one language to another. As a matter of fact, if you go down south of the border and you see the name Jesus, how do you pronounce it? Jesus. Yeah. It's just language. Language is a challenge. It really is. Some people it's a lot easier than others. I had some friends when we lived in southeast Arkansas. They were from Torreon, Mexico, and they were getting their papers and everything like that. And we were trying to help them. They were a beautiful family. They became really close to Tara and myself when we lived down there. And Carlos was my buddy, so to speak. And Carlos, English was tough for him. He would pronounce half a word. You know what I mean by that? Instead of pronouncing the entire word, he pronounced the first portion of the word. And you had to kind of figure it out. It was kind of like mimes trying to talk to each other. And but his kids, they frustrated him to no end. Those kids picked up English just like that. I mean, just like that. They had no problem picking up those kind of things. And so, I don't know why I brought that up. Just something. For adults, languages are tough. And going from one language to another can be somewhat challenging too. Because pronunciations change. Because of the letters you have available and the sounds you have available. Someone said that babies make all the sounds to all the languages. So they really are doing something productive when they're making all those baby sounds. But, a native speaker is quite different than someone who's learning the language. Because you probably never drop the improper accent on words. Can I tell you one funny story? No? Okay. We'll be done. And back in southeast Arkansas, we're having joint services between American churches, Christians, and some of the Mexican migrants. We were trying to do that, and they never trusted us. They didn't trust the gringos, and it was always a challenge. But we'd have these joint services, and we would start. On one particular occasion, we had within, not too far from where we were, there was a man pastoring a church that grew up as a missionary. He grew up his parents were missionaries in a Spanish-speaking country, somewhere in South Central America. I don't know where it was. Can't remember. So he grew up speaking Spanish fluently. So he was serving as translator. Okay? And he was doing, we had an English preacher, and he translated into Spanish, and there was a Spanish preacher, and he would translate into English, so he had double duty there. Well, the American, the English-speaking preacher was preaching, and he just said the word caterpillar. And the translator translated, all these Mexicans start laughing. After it was over, We were going to go down because they had the Mexican families, the ladies had all these food prepared for us, authentic food, not Taco Bell food, but authentic Mexican food. And as I was going down there, I was walking alongside him and said, "Were you telling jokes?" He said, "No, I wasn't." He said, "What?" He said, "Well, when so-and-so said the word caterpillar, I could not think of the Spanish word for caterpillar. So I just simply said, a worm with hair on it." And that tickled everybody there. All right. Next time we'll look at chapter 7. Things are